So good morning and welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this morning's webinar, brought to you by Campbell, Tickell and Social, where we're asking, can ESG investment really help solve the housing crisis? So it's a big question. We've got a great panel to try to answer that one. I'm Luke Cross. I head up Social Invest and work with housing providers and funders on their ESG thinking and reporting. And we have over 100 people registered for this webinar. So no doubt a reflection of the sheer quality of the panel we've put together for you today, who I shall be introducing shortly. And we've all heard a lot about ESG. You can't really talk finance without mentioning ESG or sustainability. And as ESG goes mainstream, it seems to be taking on a broader meaning from what it was arguably designed to do in the financial sector. But it's still actually very early days. And across the financial sector, there's ongoing debate about how you define ESG, what it's for, and how effective it really is. So 18 months on from our sector launching its own ESG reporting standard, and over £5 billion of ESG or sustainability linked labelled or debt being raised, it's worth asking some fundamental questions, which include, what does ESG really mean for investors, and what does it mean for housing associations, and are we all on the same page with that? Can ESG help investors and the sector align values and move towards a shared purpose? As well as demonstrating their own environmental and social creds, can HAs turn it on its head and use ESG to hold funders, partners and suppliers to account? And ultimately, can ESG help the sector to do more, whether through ESG-linked debt or the emergence of equity investors and new entrants that are saying ESG is one of the drivers for entering the sector? So to answer some of that, as I say, we have a stellar panel. We have Sarah Forster, board member of Sustainability for Housing and chief executive of the Good Economy, which helps investors measure their impact and also led the creation of the sustainability reporting standard in this sector. We've got Pete Gladwell, Group Director of Social Impact at Legal & General. Pete's also been at the forefront of bringing health into the ESG debate. We've got Imran Mubeen, Director of Treasury at Bromford, one of the pioneers in ESG finance in the housing sector, and Maggie Rafalowicz, Director at Campbell, Tickell, which sits at the heart of regulation and governance in the sector, essential features of ESG, of course. So please feel free to ask questions via the Q&A box. We'll try to address as many as possible throughout the discussion and towards the end. But before we go to each panelist for their opening comments, we want to hear from you. So here's a poll question, which should be coming up very soon. Can ESG investment really help address the housing crisis? So if you could answer yes or no to that one, that would really be appreciated. Our plan is to come back and ask you this question again towards the end of the discussion, just to see if this webinar has had any impact whatsoever and has influenced any of your thinking. So I'll give it just a few more seconds for people to answer this question. Hopefully you found the, well, it's just up on the screen, so hopefully it's an easy yes or no for all of you. Do you think ESG investment can really help solve the housing crisis? I think that's probably about enough time on the poll, isn't it? So here we go. 69% say yes, 31% say no. So what does that mean? It means, I think it means there's confidence in the potential impact of ESG. So let's see if that changes as the discussion goes on. So we'll come back to the poll towards the end. In the meantime, I'm going to hand over to the panel to give their opening comments, as I say, and we're going to start off with Sarah. So over to you, Sarah.
Great, thank you, Luke, and hi everyone, great to be here today. So yes, as Luke said, I'm Sarah Forster. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Good Economy, and I also sit on the board of Sustainability for Housing. So as a company, we provide sort of what we call impact services. That's helping organizations sort of understand, measure and enhance and report on their ESG and impact performance. And we do a lot of work with investors in housing, including some of the newcomer investors bringing equity into the sector. So some of the new fund investors. So for me, you know, I suppose at the nub of the question, right, can ESG investment help the housing crisis, is understanding the nature of the crisis. And I suppose the reality, as you probably all well know, is that, you know, we've got, you know, a huge affordability crisis in the UK. Increasingly, you know, people across all tenure types are unable to afford or buy a home, and that has actually put increasing pressures on RPs and local authorities to provide affordable housing. So it's a worsening situation. We're one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and yet we have a housing market that doesn't provide affordable housing for everyone. For us at the Good Economy, a good home is really fundamental to a good life. So it's, it's a huge challenge. I must say, it was really brought home to me recently. I was at lunch with someone who's a doctor, and her practice nurse that has worked with her for many years is in rental accommodation. The landlord is no longer renting it. I mean, I'm living in Bath. It may have gone Airbnb, I don't know. But anyway, she ended up on the homeless list with her local authority. And the doctor has given her a room in her house just to make sure she's got a roof over her head and stable. So, that's the nature of the crisis. Can ESG help? I wanted to share just a few sort of conceptual slides just quickly, just to kick us off. So hang on, let me make this full screen. Sorry, everybody. There we go. Does that work? Yeah, so what is ESG really for? I mean, very briefly, I think ESG, which is relevant to all organizations, was originally around disclosure, right? Allowing organizations to disclose and report on their ESG performance. And we can talk a little bit about what that means in housing. It's also been talked about risk management. So it was often about risk reputational management. You didn't want to be doing bad things that you perhaps got, or particularly now, I think in terms of risk management, very much the climate crisis and net zero are absolutely seen as factors that we need to focus on risk management. We were put in the S bucket, the sort of, equity, social equity and inequality theme there. But increasingly, there is a move towards ESG as sort of creating value and ultimately, which is where we focus on, can it create positive impact, positive outcomes for people? So can it actually solve the problem or help solve the problem of the affordable housing crisis? So just as some of you may be aware, but just in case you're not, we were involved in facilitating the development of the Sustainability Reporting Standard. And I think it's important to say, okay, in housing, what do we mean by ESG? And what this standard tried to do is just to identify, okay, what are the criteria, the themes that matter from an ESG perspective? And as you see, we actually put the S first, and top there is affordability and security of housing. So, I suppose my point there would be is if it depends what you do with the investment, right? Whether or not it will help tackle the housing crisis. So if investment is being raised to invest in, say, more social rent or more genuinely affordable homes that meet local needs, every housing market has different needs, then yes, I think ESG investment can make a difference. And perhaps what it does do is, and we've heard this from both RPs and investors and lenders who adopt the standard, it makes them focus more on these issues. It makes them think more deeply across their operations. How are we doing on affordability? How are we doing on building safety, resident voice, climate change? So I think it puts the focus on these matters and ideally shifts strategy and sort of operations to improve outcomes in these areas. But I'll let my other colleagues speak to that. Just finally, this is a very complex slide, but in addition to working with investors, lenders on a sector standard that was driven by the social housing sector, we've also been working with a smaller group of investors bringing equity into the housing sector. So these include funds, such as LNG and M&G and more specialist funds investing in specialist supported living and homelessness accommodation. I think our aim there was to say, a lot of people tagging themselves impact investors, but what does that mean? And for us, it means having very clear impact objectives and then measuring performance against them. And I think on the left, I suppose, yes, if this investment ticked all these boxes, helped increase supply, targeting need, deepened affordability, improved, people's quality of home in the places that they live in, and ensured quality services to residents. Yes, if it really delivers on that, I would say actually this kind of investment could help solve the housing crisis. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Sarah. I'm going to go straight on to Pete now to give the LNG perspective or the Pete Gladwell perspective. One in the same.
We're about to find out. If I have a Stuart Kirk moment, then you'll know something went wrong along the way. But yeah, I've got an interview with HSBC this afternoon, actually, so it should be fun. Enough jokes, which probably aren't that funny. Anyway, moving on. Thank you for inviting me to share a few words. Pete Gladwell, head up social impact and investment at L&G. I think it's just important to highlight the journey that groups like Legal and General have been on over the last 15 years, because it probably, whilst it sounds like a long time to go back, it is really essential, I think, to understanding how this could be a solution or not. So if you go back 15 years, which was sadly when I joined Legal and General, we were kind of sitting pretty in a office building in Coleman Street and just investing in stocks and shares and bonds with very little hands on the ground experience or really trying to grapple with some of the kind of social issues. And then a few of us have kind of joined over the last few years who have really cared and been quite interested in some of these social issues and how we use the huge amounts of society's money, pensions and savings that have been trusted with us to address some of these social issues. So that started off by being a bit more around investing into social housing, and we've made some very large investments with the likes of Places for People, 4,000 social homes many years ago, which is still going really well, and released a lot of extra equity for that housing association. And then we kind of realized the sector itself needed more equity, and if it was going to have the impact it could have. And we've recently released this affordable white paper that my colleagues Simon Sentry and Jason Palmer worked on. But it's probably worth you guys knowing that white paper, the genesis of that was kind of 5 or 6 years ago, when internally we were knocking around ideas around how we invest to enable the social housing sector to do more. I will never allow our RP to be described as a for-profit RP, because it simply wasn't set up for profit. It was set up for purpose because we recognized the sector needed more equity. And we do need to make a profit. We do need to make a financial return, not least because we're trying to pay 8 million people's pensions. But I can assure you, the reason it was set up and that paper was being knocked around 5 or 6 years ago was not because we all sat there thinking, if we pull this off, we'll be able to drive a Bentley and, get a Lamborghini for the weekend. It was because we recognized that the housing sector had huge potential to change people's lives. But it needed more equity and more people like L&G and M&G and others sharing the risk alongside the fantastic work people like Bromford do. So it's been a big push for us to really try to get out of the ivory tower and have far more desire to share the risk. And you'll see in coming months that we will be moving alongside RPs to share the development risk phase as well as the occupational risk phase, because we just see that as a way we can have more social impact and try and address some of this housing crisis. The other thing that my colleagues are very involved in, I think is fantastic, is also trying to lend to the likes of Bromford in a way that supports them to do more and aligns us with them in terms of some of the key definitions and key ways the sector has an impact, and particularly try and support them as they decarbonise, for example. So that's kind of a halfway house. I mean, I'm very clear in those situations, it's still the likes of Bromford who will be doing the hard work, and we're supporting them wherever we can. So it's a bit different from our own RP. But I suppose the point with all of these is it's trying to look across the spectrum and saying, where is there a useful social role for someone like Legal and General to play, and where are we in danger of stepping on the toes of the likes of Bromford, and in which case let's kind of retreat there and identify places where we can have an impact. That said, if you ask me a straightforward answer to the question, I'd probably still say no. ESG investment won't on its own help the housing crisis, because it's just really important to stress that things like planning are massive issues that for me are really pertinent if we're going to see the amount of housing that we need as a country addressed. And one of the things that is always ironic when you work in a company like L&G is, you just realize that the world is awash with capital and investment, and money is actually rare. People always say, oh, we need more money. Actually, money is rarely the only solution to things. Actually, a lot of the solutions is in things like planning, is in proper partnerships with government. And you'll have seen the announcement we made with West Midlands Combined Authority, a £4 billion commitment to that region. That's all about trying to join up the various dots in society, rather than just saying investment's the answer. You know, if you take more of our money, all your problems will be solved. I think we need to realize it's a bit more holistic than that. So a couple of thoughts for me. Welcome challenge and debate later.
Good stuff. Thanks very much, Pete. Moving straight to Imran now for the Housing Association perspective. Imran, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I was just coming off mute there. No, thank you, Pete. And thank you for recognizing that it is Bromford and the HAs who do the hard work. That's always great to have there recorded on screen and something to share with your colleagues at L&G, I'm sure. But no, we've done some fantastic work together. I guess my starting point here is, yes, there is a housing crisis. There has been for some time. There will continue to be for some time. We see that in sort of two ways. Firstly, in terms of supply and the number of affordable and social homes available to those people who cannot access the private market, but then also the quality of those homes. Do they meet the decent home standards? Are they energy efficient? Are they fit for purpose, particularly in an age of rising inflation, rising energy costs, and at a time where our customers really are facing challenges more than ever before? So the challenge is very much there. I think what HAs have done very well historically, we've been sitting pretty on some of the leading credit ratings in the sector. At Bromford, the sector as a whole, I think, is a very well-rated single A sector and will continue to be hopefully for some time. But we really have seen a rising tide of energy, of interest, of curiosity, really leading to some very pointed questions from Pete and colleagues in the investor community around what is it that we're doing to help and support customers? What are we doing to ensure that the quality of our homes meets the right standards? And I think that's really started to create for us an opportunity to take our narrative onto an investor roadshow where we move beyond just the financials and we start telling the story of the organization, where I think the ESG play has been really powerful. And a year ago, we published our sustainable finance framework. And that was a really great opportunity for us to showcase what we do around the delivery of housing, but what we do in other areas. So reducing homelessness, increasing diversity across our colleague base, moving to an electric fleet of repairs vans, moving to more green and energy efficient office space. All of those things are incredibly important and sit very firmly now alongside our financial profile, our credit profile, in positioning us as a home for those investors who want a responsible place to position their investment and reassure their underlying investors, be it pension holders, etc., that that money is being deployed in a responsible and socially responsible way. I think we've seen some really interesting products come into the sector. I think the sustainability linked lending has very much now gained some momentum. We issued a loan with NatWest a couple of years ago. It was the first green loan in the sector. And that really helped us to focus internally on working towards an aspirational target around EPC C and above. So we appreciate that isn't the full net zero carbon journey. It's really the starting point, but an important milestone to reach. And really pleasingly, off the back of that arrangement, that loan, we now are at 86% of our portfolio being at EPC C and above, very much on track to hit 100% in 2028, well in advance of the government target for 2030. I think what that allows us to do, there's a lot of discussion around loan documents and savings and sort of how all of that fits together. Are they meaningful or are they not? I think for us, the greatest benefit of a sustainable linked loan is the community of interest it really creates within the organization. So suddenly you have Treasury and asset management, existing homes, strategy, risk, everybody coming together cross-directorate to focus and coalesce behind an important goal. I think where that really comes through is if you can establish that golden thread between a corporate strategy, a sustainability strategy, then enshrining that into a sustainable finance framework, wrapping that then into annual impact reports, absolutely talking into the sustainability reporting standard that I think is a very good starting point for the sector. I think when you can establish that as a golden thread and really infuse all the areas of sustainability that work through the organization, I think it is a very compelling case for future investment. I think at the moment it seems to be a bit of a luxury. I think we've very quickly moved into this now is a prerequisite to issue a sector leading rate on a bond or absolutely pulling down margins on a bank loan to a level that's at the competitive edge of the market. I think if you can have a defined aspiration and objective around how you use some of the savings to further support social metrics or sustainability agendas and programs across the organization, I think that really helps to close that virtuous circle. So I think there's some way to go on this journey. We're really pleased to be leading that at the front end of that journey. I think the loan agreements that we've established in the sector have been really powerful. I think I'd like to see the investor community challenge us even more on some of those targets, and for that to really help us move forward some of our corporate strategy, business planning, and really have this front and center as we go out to the funder markets.
Great, thank you, Imran. That's a really, really interesting stuff. Really putting the focus on the benefits for housing associations there. And we're going to go to Maggie to provide, I think, more of a regulatory type view on
regulatory. Hello everyone. I'm a director at Campbell, Tickell, and I do a lot of work on development and regeneration. And because of that, I've attended to actually lead on the registration of new LPs, because usually they come in terms of actually wanting to increase supply. But I just wanted to comment slightly on Imran's point about the importance of the whole organisation being involved in this. I recently did a piece of work on community investment for a very large housing association, one of the largest in the country. And they wanted to know what the future of community investment was going to be. So I interviewed a lot of people in the organization, including the director of Treasury. And she actually told me that one of the most important selling points they've got in order to, when they're going seeking funding, is bringing their community investment director with them, because then they can actually prove how good, all the good work that they're doing. So it actually is a real selling point. So just bear that in mind. I think people have already talked about, the need for affordable housing. When I first started working in social housing, it was geared at the people in the most housing need, people who weren't in work and who had medical need. And as years have progressed, as Sarah was saying, the cohort of people who simply can't afford to get their own homes in the private market has grown until it goes to nurses and doctors and teachers, etc., who simply can't afford their own home. If you couple that with the fact that existing housing associations have to actually divert resources away from development in looking after their own stock, it's clear that the need for new entrants is really important. Now, and the bottom line is that we need to provide good quality homes. So we welcome new entrants. But it's not just the numbers that are important, but the quality of what is being provided, both in terms of the fabric of the building and also the management and support giving to residents. And I've often said, even though I've worked on the investment side, it's often easier to build homes than it is to manage them in the long term and to maintain it. Now, I deal with a lot of organizations who want to set up a for-profit. Now, Pete doesn't like the word for-profit, but that's the way it goes. And I often joke with the regulator that I ought to get a commission, because I spend a lot of time trying to convince people that they're not, they shouldn't actually try to do it. It's a tortuous process to get registered. And also people don't really quite understand all the obligations that are there. Now, the regulator wants to register organizations that will provide long-term quality social housing, and the process has become more difficult. Now, you need to demonstrate independence, that the decisions that you're doing are on behalf of your tenants and the benefits of the RP and not the parent. The regulators worry that funds will seep away, either by excessive profits, I know you don't like the word profit, or by paying too much for services that a subsidiary will be paying, and that they won't be able to provide good quality housing management, and not geared up for sort of investors that will sort of want to make a quick profit and run. Not that this would happen, but it is there. Now, I'm happy to say that we've actually worked with a lot of good new providers that have sort of a patient capital approach, like L&G, M&G, and Octopus Real Estate, either with the registration or purchasing an existing reg. So it's really important for new entrants to understand that they have to work within the grain of the sector norms, and that they're entering into an environment which is regulated, and regulated for good reason, and that their expectations of performance. We've got consumer regulation is being ramped up. Before, the focus was on financial, but now it's consumer. That the quality of the housing management and assets in the public eye. So, it's a staple item on ITV and other media outlets. The housing ombudsman is wrapping up and is active. You've got just sustainability reporting standards. And the boards also need to demonstrate that they're doing it, not just doing it, but to demonstrate. So the quality of the data that you're collecting, the sort of things that Sarah was on her spreadsheet was showing on a thing. So can ESG help the housing crisis? It's not the only solution, quite right, but it's important. I think it's obvious that it's really important component. In some ways, the ESG values are the same as what housing associations all values when they started. And let's face it, some housing associations haven't been doing a great job. So I think actually new providers ramping up the quality and putting the pressure on is a really, really good thing.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Maggie. That was great. So we have the Q&A box there ready and waiting. I know we've got a question in. We'd love to see more questions come in. We're just going to have a bit of a discussion in the meantime as well. And I mean, one of my first questions or areas that I think it'd be worthwhile discussing is this point about people's different interpretations of what ESG is there to do, and to what extent the interpretation that we see in the financial sector among investors matches to what we're seeing in the social housing sector at the moment. And I suppose there's going to be, different people are going to see these things in different ways, but I think it'd be useful for us to discuss, whether or not it's a for-profit provider like L&G Affordable Homes, or another for-profit or equity investor coming into the sector, or an existing debt provider, is what they're talking about in ESG terms, does that match with how the sector is viewing it? So where should we go, Sarah? I think that's maybe a good place to start with you.
No, sure, happy. And actually, I kind of wanted to get to the question from Helen, because I think in a way that's a good question, because I think in the end, whether it matches, in a way, it depends who both parties are, and how they are using ESG, right? So it's used in very different ways. For some, it's a sort of tick box. It's a sort of fulfillment of even what regulatory standards are now requiring in terms of ESG performance. For others, it is much more around, making a positive difference around these sort of ESG areas. And I think, actually, Helen's point is, what does default look like on ESG funding? And, we know that some of the big housing providers that have raised ESG finance have also had terrible failings in some of their properties, right? Well, actually, one of the things we've been calling for, and I don't think it's there yet, and it'd be great to hear what MG have to say, is that, we think, we think social and environmental performance measures should be put in legal agreements, right? So if you're serious about ESG and you're doing a sustainability linked loan, that actually performance against those performance indicators is in the legal docs, and actually how you measure the standard is meaningful. So actually, I don't think the decent home standard is, I think a lot of people say it doesn't actually necessarily ensure a decent home. So what do you mean by a quality home? And then ensuring that, in a way, then finance, if it's truly driven by purpose, can actually be like a carrot and stick approach. Finance can actually fundamentally shift markets if finance is driven not just by financial returns, but social returns. So, I think that partnership and alignment of what you're trying to achieve and really focusing on the positive outcomes can make it a force, but it needs teeth. And I would say right now, a lot of the ESG loans don't necessarily have, the sort of teeth that perhaps Helen would like to see. It's not called a default, but yeah, welcome others' view.
Yeah, interesting. Imran, can I go to you on this one as well? I mean, not least because you did talk about investors maybe demanding more, actually, and also your own experiences of the ESG funding and so on.
Yeah, I think as with anything, there's a journey with these things. I think where the sustainability linked lending has started is largely they are single KPIs. So I think we are already doing what Sarah's described, but very much focused on a single KPI. And so there's now a number of loans in the sector that are linked to the EPCC journey. But of course, sustainability is much more than just EPCC. I think the deal that Martin and the team executed at L&Q in the capital markets recently with the link to Scope 1 and 2 emissions was taking that journey sort of further to the next step. And I think I would like to see, whether it's a bond, private placement, or a loan agreement, I think there is something in what Sarah's saying. I think we should have perhaps multi-layered targets. I think they should be stretching targets. I think we should be able to demonstrate real additionality around a sustainability agenda. just the one thing I'd say really at the outset is very often when I'm talking to people in the sector, whether that's the HA side or investor side, we very quickly move from sustainability to carbon reduction. Now, clearly carbon reduction is an important pillar of sustainability, but the way we view sustainability at Bromford is really all pillars of ESG. And that's why we did establish our second SLL linked to a governance metric around reducing the gender pay gap. So there isn't a carbon play there, but absolutely fits firmly within our broader sustainability strategy, which then links into our corporate strategy. But yeah, I think we should be back out to the market in the next couple of years. We'd be looking to issue a benchmark size bond. We'd be looking to enter into further bank lending, and absolutely we'd want that to follow on from our sustainable finance framework, and for those objectives to very clearly be set out so we can demonstrate what we are delivering with the funding that we're bringing in. I don't think it's enough for us to just say we're delivering social housing. I think it has to be we're delivering social housing and we're supporting our communities and our customers. We're helping to address some of the real societal problems of our time. And I think the real benefit from our perspective at Bromford, sitting pretty on 45,000 homes, is we can really make a difference with that sort of volume and that reach across the Midlands and the Southwest. So I think there is actually a moral imperative for us to do this, not just a funding and finance play, but there are some real challenges in the world in which we live. And I think we have a real opportunity to address some of those head on through the funding, but also through the delivery and the hard work that Pete referred to that sort of takes place on the HA side.
I'm going to go to Pete in a moment, but Imran, just to follow up on that in terms of Helen's point, just around, when things do go a bit wrong, things have gone very wrong in some cases across the sector. I mean, how should or can that relate to ESG funding, and also kind of ESG reporting? I suppose it's part of the question.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think, and hopefully Sarah will agree with this, is I think the SRS itself is dynamic. I don't think it's enshrined and set in stone forever as a set of measures that will serve us for the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I think at the moment it is a preliminary sort of data presentation, but I would like to see that evolve further and for it to start to capture points of failure and also sort of preempt or early warning signs where there might be points of failure around a sustainability agenda. I think there's perhaps some semantics in some of the sustainability linked lending arena. We've talked about it at Bromford as a margin improvement if we meet a target. Others have talked about it as a penalty. But whether it's lost income or additional cost, there absolutely should be an impact, a negative impact of not meeting the sustainability agenda that the organization set out to meet with the funding it brought in. So I think having a very well articulated set of objectives and then having a very demonstrable track record which can survive an external third-party audit, and for all of that to be presented to demonstrate success or failure for a financial improvement or a financial penalty is absolutely the way this should go.
Yeah, great. And Pete, over to you on this. I mean, just in terms of ESG having more teeth, or should we be looking at rewards rather than penalties? But also just to throw another element into the question. I mean, this is we're focusing on failings in the social housing sector. We quite often see failings in the financial sector across the investment industry, or questions around the choices that are being made there. Do we need to flip this a little bit and ask the questions of some of the investors out there, what their track record's like?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think the key thread in this for me is it's about people first and foremost, and the environment, in as much as the environment also clearly influences people's lives to a huge extent, and the climate crisis influences huge lives of people. So we can get a little bit caught up in clever financials and clever legals, but at the end of the day, this is about people's lives and providing a good home, a safe home, a clean home, a decent home for people at an affordable rent. And if you look back at the history of this sector, it's not just that they're doing the hard work now, Imran. They've been doing the hard work for decades. Some of these organisations, go back to Notting Hill, Guinness Trust, are just fantastic histories born out of a genuine care for people. So and that's why, as an investor, we love to back them, because we recognize our role is to use society's money to benefit society. And if I invest that money behind a housing association, there's a good chance it's going to have a positive impact. It just being very direct and honest about the social media and failings. I don't believe everything I read on social media for a start, but some of these things are shocking and really disappointing. And if there's any truth behind them, it really is disappointing. But for me, that's kind of emblematic of the need for the sector to keep aligned with what its social purpose is and what it's there to do, rather than me wrapped in ever more complex and punitive legal structures, as if I'm somehow the moral boundaries of a sector that in and at its core was created to improve people's lives. So I kind of worry slightly about going down that route, because I kind of feel like if it's down to legal in general to provide the guardrails on the bowling alley, then we're probably not bowling very straight anyway, if you'll excuse the analogy. So for me, I don't want to get to the point where investors are kind of micromanaging what at the end of the day should be some of the most dynamic and impactful organizations in this country, because they need me to do that. It feels like it's all gone a bit head over heels. I was thinking a more impolite phrase, but I tried to make it more polite for this audience. So yeah, I don't. That's where I'm at with it, Luke. I don't know if that's helpful or it's right, but I just feel like the sector has so much impact on people's lives, and that's why we back it, and that's why we're putting equity in to try and enable it to do more.
Isn't part of the point not necessarily that we're looking to the financial sector or investors to give us some sort, to be the ethical compass, or to give us a direction around purpose. Perhaps it's more about injecting some rigor into what's being measured and demonstrated within the sector. And I suppose the argument could go that the financial sector is quite good at that, into provide introducing some sort of way to demonstrate performance and to be held to account. And maybe the social housing sector hasn't been as good as it could be on that front over the years.
I really agree with the need for rigor, and people like the Good Economy do a fantastic job around some of that. But I'm afraid I've just seen games played with it too many times. It doesn't solve the issue. If I know some impact investors who are total sharks who still come out with a report saying, look, we're generating millions of pounds of social value, and it's nothing to do with that actually if they took a proper counterfactual, they'd be generating negative social value. They've just persuaded a consultant to find some numbers and come out with something that's supposedly rigorous. So I kind of, what am I supposed to do? Go around and say, right, tell me how many homes you've got with cockroaches this year, and I want to see that number go down, or I'm defaulting your bond. You kind of lost the plot a bit, I think, when you get to that level, haven't you? I just need to trust that if you're a big housing association, you're going to be not putting tenants into those kind of environments, and there has to be some element of me not. Rigor should not mean me asking to fill in the form about the number of cockroaches in the houses. We've kind of got to the wrong level, I think, there. So there's an element of trust and genuine collaboration and working with people who you see share your values in all of this. And there's also always going to be an element in the sector, whether it's investors or new entrants, or even, dare I say, old entrants who are just doing a pretty crap job and letting a lot of people down. And that's disappointing. But I'm not convinced that huge amounts of kind of rigorous spreadsheets are really going to be the answer to that, because they can always be gamed, and we all know that. Let's be frank.
Yeah,
Luke, if I can just perhaps to sort of come in there, I think we've gone straight into looking at kind of target setting, penalties, and so forth. I think there's something for me which comes before that, which is in investors sort of asking more questions about the sustainability agenda. I think we're now doing a much better job than ever around telling the story. I think Pete's absolutely right. This sector has always offered great value right across the ESG space. And it's a sector which inherently lends itself to that, full of really passionate, clever people who want to support more delivery. I think in telling that story, it's not just sort of ensuring that resonates with the investor community. It also takes us to a place as a housing association where we then know where perhaps some of the gaps are, where some of the opportunities might be, the things that we really care about, and the areas where we want to deliver more. So before we get into any of the, is it 5 basis points, is it 10, where does all of that go? I think there's something which is perhaps a little bit more subtle around having a discussion, as Pete said, discussing those shared values, perhaps perhaps challenging one another around the areas of work in which we're leading on, and really identifying from that how we want to play into sustainability. I think some of these sort of ratchets and sort of links to sustainable lending come sort of at the end of that process, where you've really kind of determined where you want to play, and then just having an agreement around how some of that might be measured. And I think there has to be some element of measurability, otherwise, you know, we continue to campaign in sound bites, and we never really get down to demonstrating value.
Yeah, thank you, Imran. Yeah, Maggie, I was going to ask you to come in.
I think, I mean, every time I'm just thinking of the days back in the Audit Commission where, you know, you had to sort of, you had loads of KPIs and people, you know, muttered and were really upset that they had to spend all this time collecting information. But it did provide a certain discipline, and it did actually provide a framework with which in organizations were able to improve. And you could say that if you're a really good organization, you're going to meet these indicators anyway. And I think it just provides, it also brings in, and like, you know, Imran was saying at the beginning, the entire organization is focused around what these are. And I think sometimes data collection and the way it's expressed is not necessarily a very strong point. You know, you can actually get different organizations providing what seemingly the same information, but they take it from different sources, or they do it presented in a different way. So I think the actual framework of it is actually quite important. And I think depending on the organization, this is a very large organization like Notting Hill, Genesis, like Bromford, it's fine, but there are a lot of medium-sized organizations that actually need that support. So I think actually I think there's an alignment of values, but there really needs a bit more discipline in actually how things are delivered.
Great, thanks, Maggie. Sarah, can I bring you in on this as well?
Well, yes. I mean, clearly, I mean, Maggie, you know, sort of just taking off that, the idea of the framework was to make it sort of easy and because it was developed by the sector for the sector. So these are not, in fact, that the whole reason, I mean, just to go back to the beginning, that the sustainability reporting standard was developed was because treasurers in housing organisations were getting questionnaires from finance providers, particularly the banks, with a whole set of ESG questions which were completely irrelevant. They were actually designed for big corporates, which is where the global standards are. So then the sector said, you know, and hats off actually to Susan Hickey from Peabody, who said, look, can we just design a standard that works for us? And you were there right at the beginning. And I think the whole point was, let's come up with a sort of reporting framework where we're focusing on things that matter to the sector and important to our sustainability strategies. And certainly we've just done the 1-year report, which is coming out this week. And, you know, the key headline, actually, I've got it here, is that the SRS helps drive strategic direction, operational decision-making, and ambition for ESG performance. And that was a really great finding, that it's actually really galvanized organizations to focus on sustainability factors. I mean, I think my concern a little bit is that, you know, certainly in the markets, the financial markets, the focus is on climate change. And, you know, as Pete said, you know, for us, housing is about people, and, you know, there's so much that's needed to be spent on retrofit. But that said, you know, just actually, and I saw this point about new build versus existing stock. I mean, both need to be invested in. But I think our main concern is, are we genuinely, you know, meeting these pretty much emergency needs for homes, families now, and temporary accommodation? And, you know, local authorities completely backed up with these housing lists. And so I think, you know, we'd like to see more focus on you know, on the S. And also to Pete's point, I think, you know, partnership, bringing in the government subsidy that's needed, planning, you know, frankly, low pay, but that's an economic issue. But, you know, there are multiple factors at play in the housing market. So I think understanding that is really important to being part of the solution.
Yeah. And we've got some great comments coming in. Not so many questions, more comments, which is great. All part of the discussion, or part of the conversation. Fiona Dickinson at Aberdeen, another investor perspective here, following on from Imran's points. Monitoring of ESG performance, external validation of ESG funding KPIs with absolute transparency has to be best practice, rather than an HA marking its own homework with self-validation.
Yeah.
And we all need to be careful to avoid the taint of perhaps valid, in brackets, greenwashing criticism. Discuss.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, Luke, I absolutely agree. So we are very firmly committed to setting out any measures on our sustainability linked loan portfolio in our annual accounts. So that will go through the sort of external third party audit assurance as the rest of the accounts are on an annual basis. So I absolutely agree. I think it has to be very clear, very transparent. It should be independently verified. And I think that's where you get to the sort of data quality point. Just picking up on the points sort of previously from Sarah and Maggie, I sort of share some of Maggie's perhaps concerns around this not just becoming a data collection and data presentation exercise, but I would just draw a bit of an analogy to credit ratings. So we go out and get a Moody's rating or an S&P rating, but we then go on investor roadshows. We don't just present the Moody's rating and leave it there. We, take it upon ourselves to present our credit story and to answer questions around that. And I think sustainability will be absolutely the same thing. There will be a set of data points that we do want to present, but then talking around that, I think there's a story and how sustainability manifests itself at Bromford. So, it's not just doing the SRS and then your homework is done. I think that's the starting point, but then there's a real story around that. And to my earlier point, I do think the data collection under SRS will evolve, will be dynamic, and will change over time to meet the needs of the investor community, but also to reflect what we are doing really well as HAs. I think we have to be very realistic. I think investors do want some ability to compare performance, and I think providing some standardized data really helps to do that. But as with credit ratings, two associations at A2 are not necessarily rated the same way by the investor community in how they see the credit profile. So I think, to be fair to Pete and colleagues out there in the investor space, I think we are already, and we will continue to see even more sophistication around the number of questions, the quality of questions, the depth and breadth of those questions. And as HAs, we really have to meet that challenge head on, not just to service the investor and funder community, but really to reassure ourselves that we're doing the right thing in all of these spaces. And if we can't communicate that, it probably means we're not doing it well enough in the first place.
Thank you, Imran. So another comment here, which has got 5 likes, which is the most prolifically liked, I think, is that a phrase? Liked comment on the Q&A. It feeds into some of the stuff Sarah's talking about around affordability, some of the other points we've made. But from Tristan Samuels, for investors, ESG KPIs focused on new build development seems easily achieved. The problem with quality is the existing stock. I'd hope that KPIs could be broader to ensure RPs are looking backwards as well as forwards. I mean, to the point about can ESG help to solve the housing crisis? I mean, the housing crisis isn't just about new suppliers. It is the affordability crisis that we're talking about, and currently it feels to be a quality crisis as well. So who would like to come in on that? Maggie, would you like to come in? Pete's got his hand up. I'm going to go to Pete.
Pete can go first, actually, and I'll come.
Okay, I didn't want to jump in ahead, but I mean, I suspect this is Tristan Samuels from Portsmouth, if I've guessed correctly. But it's Portsmouth City Council, who are a fantastic organisation doing a lot in this space with their housing stock. I mean, this is the stuff that really excites me. Is there are still some really big societal and environmental challenges out there that the sector that we haven't co-created the right mechanism from my perspective to address. Now, let's just take retrofitting. There's no incentive really for me to kind of get out of my ivory tower, I'm sitting pretty counting my pennies, and go out and actually engage on how do we enable registered providers to retrofit their homes. But at the end of the day, this is a big societal issue. There isn't enough capital to invest in this space at the moment. It's highly unlikely that local authorities and RPs will be able to do it on their balance sheets. So even the sustainability loan linked measure will have its boundaries. So it's probably going to involve the likes of L&G and others bringing in our own balance sheets, taking some risk around the performance of retrofit measures, the performance of the contractors, etc. There's zero commercial incentive for me to engage in that conversation at the moment. Whatever we co-design, no doubt someone will come along and Fiona will do it 5 bips cheaper, and I've lost my commercial edge. She's very good value. But my point is, we're still engaging in this. We're talking a lot with RPs, we're talking about with central government, BEIS, Treasury, local authorities, because we're doing it for purpose, Maggie, not for profit, for purpose, because we can see that there is an issue here that needs to be addressed and needs serious investment. So I think Tristan's actually right. A lot of these issues, particularly backwards looking, require a huge amount of investment. And I get really excited by this because we're going to create something that's going to improve thousands of people's lives, get people out of fuel poverty, improve environmental outcomes. But it requires those of us who really want to make an impact to step up. And I don't know if that is ESG funding. I don't know if it is just kind of knocking off a few basis points. That's great. I'm not demeaning that, but some of this stuff is more about impact and intentionality. And you know, those who want to make an impact, I really hope will do. And I'm just really keen we pull together a coalition of the willing who want to do some of this. And you know, we've got plenty of cash, but we need opportunities and partners and people to work with for some of these big challenges that still remain for us as a sector.
I just say this, Pete, I don't actually think profit is necessarily a bad word. It depends.
Neither do I. It's just not why we did this.
It depends on how it's used. I just think it's a major thing, actually. I mean, one of the, I'm just looking at the sustainability standard on building safety and quality. You know, resident safety and building quality are well managed, but not necessarily that you've actually got it. And up and down the country, because I work nationally, and you know, you can tell how important retrofitting was actually going to be. And if there was any way that you could actually get it funded, it's hugely important, makes a huge impact in terms of fuel poverty. It makes a huge impact on the quality of health and well-being. And so I think that if there was a way to do it, over to you funders and others to how we could invest in that. So I think, and it's a balance between the new supply that we need, because, you know, I work with local authorities, homelessness is going up, issues in temporary accommodation across the country is going up. But on the other hand, there are really poor quality housing, which needs to be tackled as well.
Okay, thank you. Got a few more comments and questions. Just one from me, because this has kind of come up a bit throughout the discussion and comes up quite often. ESG and impact, and going back to that slide earlier, Sarah. So are we really drawing a line between ESG and impact, or is that line really far, you know, much more blurred than some people might like to suggest? Because ultimately, if you're that point about reporting on ESG criteria, some of those you'd think would be, you know, impact measures as well, you know, if taken forward in the right way, would be. Sarah, can I ask you about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, definitely there's more blurring, and there's no doubt that some of the ESG measures, as you say, are also measures of impact performance. So the metrics can be the same. I think where we differentiate impact, and sort of Pete's, you know, sort of actually said this, it's about, you know, intentionality, to have a defined impact with a defined objective. So it's not just, you know, investing in social housing and it ticks my ESG box. It's like, you know, we want to, so I sort of going back to the sort of impact, we want to increase, you know, the supply of affordable homes, but it would also be for whom, what tenure, you know, these are the right homes, are they the right size of homes, are they in the right location, are they the right quality? You know, it is about, in the end, the outcomes for people. So, and the environment. So for us, impact is the world of impact investing, right, has developed a whole range of norms and practices, which are called impact management. And that's the idea that you actually integrate impact considerations into every step of the decision-making process as an organization. It becomes part of your strategy. And that actually is, you know, we find with a lot of our clients, that's actually quite a big new way of sort of doing business, actually. And actually it gets back to culture and values, because certainly a lot of investor clients, you know, that's not where they've come from. I mean, you know, LNG has a societal ambition. I have to say, a lot of the firms we work with, it's not where they started. But they, you know, I think what's exciting actually is I think there's a real zeitgeist right now in the financial markets that a lot of investment organizations, and, you know, maybe some are doing it, you know, they're wolf in sheep's clothing, but let's hope with enough sort of, you know, validation, verification, and you know, slamming down on impact washing, that actually, you know, we are going to see more capital really working in partnership with housing organisations. Yeah, Maggie, thoughts?
Yeah, I was just saying that yesterday in the FT, there was a whole section, big section, about ESG funding across different industries, and how actually people wanted to be more transparent, and how shareholders are taking much greater interest in what the impact is, and how you measure it. I mean, this is not just in housing development. It was, had to do with electric cars, it had to do with a whole range of things. I think actually it's the approach people are taking and the changes that, I think the world has changed quite a lot in the last few years, what with COVID, Ukraine, etc. The world is a bit more shaky, and I think people are trying to want their investment to actually make a difference. And there are enough people who actually do. So I think they're looking to what the impact actually means. And as much as I hate tick boxes, in terms of actually recording information, you have to start somewhere, and then you can actually, it becomes a more mature approach to assess.
So are we almost in agreement that new investors, for example, new entrants that come into the sector, if they do make declarations about ESG commitments or impact investing, is that better than investors that don't? Basically, does it move the dial a bit? Does it hold them to account in some way? Does it give assurances to people in the sector and maybe the regulator?
Honesty plays a big role. Actually, I mean, I'd rather have someone who says, well, this is what I want to do and I'm going to deliver it, than someone says, oh, I want to do this, that, and the other, and then doesn't do anything. So I mean, all things being equal, you'd want to have someone, with an ESG, that it is actually part of their values and part of their delivery. But the transparency is important as well.
Okay. Right, a question Graham Aitken has asked. The case for taking ESG seriously as part of the future of the sector is clear. But if you're a small to medium-sized social landlord, he's asked for the top 5 things you should be doing. Might take a while. I mean, can we say 1 or 2 things? Does anybody want to?
Well, I think the obvious thing perhaps is to go to Pete's colleagues at L&G, who aren't interested in money and profit apparently anymore. So that's where the cheap funding clearly is. But perhaps just from a HA perspective, I think what I would say is we found it very powerful to look at the SRS and identify within that the areas that we can already talk to, and perhaps where some of the gaps might be. And although I don't think the SRS itself is exhaustive, and I don't think the reporting should start and finish with the SRS, I think organizations should absolutely sort of print their impact reporting in their own image. I think the SRS is actually a really powerful starting point, almost as a health check of where are you now, and also which areas do you have no data or intel around, where work streams can be set up to start identifying where those gaps are. I think that has to be the starting point before you start putting the kind of story and that journey together. And I think having all of that in order before you approach the investor community is really important. And that's something we were very keen to do at Bromford. So the framework was published a year ago. We're not in the market for any additional funding for another sort of 12 months, but it's really important for us to go out now with our first set of impact reports to really show that commitment and really to start shaping that narrative.
Yeah,
thank you.
And Luke,
Sarah.
Obviously I'm going to plug it, but I would say, number one would be, as a small and medium-sized organization, actually, even if you're not looking to raise external finance, sign up to the SRS, because the whole point is that it's led by the sector. So we've just launched sort of the version 1.2. There's a webinar on June the 16th. All the practitioners are coming in the room, and there's quite a nice community going on now talking about, even retrofit solutions. How do we meet these criteria? So I think the community of adopters is a good one, and that includes, RPs and investors. So yes, do, if you haven't, check it out, and it's free to join up. So get involved.
Yeah. So I guess the only challenge I'd put out there is it's not a case of just sitting pretty on the SRS and the data around that. I think there has to be an individual approach from the HA, and it has to be about putting your own DNA onto that story. I think where I don't want the sector to go is to a very sanitized place of sort of tables of data, but we kind of miss that customer piece and what we're really here for. So I know Pete's been sitting pretty there for a while, so I'll just cue him in at that point if he wants to give the investor perspective.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's exactly what I was going to say, actually. Imran's phrased it really well. There's, it is really a question for me, if we're approached by a housing association, of what is their social role and what's the need for investment locally? You know, what's driving this conversation? And if it's just continuation of business as usual, it may just be a bond issuance is the right idea, or it may be a bilateral loan. If there's something about this that's around kind of additional effort, or sorry, got a classic time for a call to come in. If there's something around this which is regeneration, where we may need to be taking more risk, then we can clearly see that's the social need, and then how best do we meet it. But you know, someone earlier asked the questions about charities as well. We struggle sometimes to fund charities because of our regulatory framework. There are other people like SASC, Prince's Trust, etc., who are better at funding charities to do some fantastic work. So for me, it's about really saying, what's the social need, what's your role in this, how are you making an impact, and then come and have a chat. And you know, if we're the right people to provide the funding, that's fantastic. But there are other sources of funding, including people on this call, who may well be better shaped. And the point of purpose before profit is that we actually also sometimes say, actually, I don't think we're the right point of call for you. We could make some money from this, but other people will do a better job. I think that has a lot of integrity if we do it properly as well.
Great, thanks, Pete. So does that talk? I know we're pretty much out of time, but does that talk to Steve's question about, you know, your appetite for sharing development risk, you know, what the scale and shape of L&G's ambition in this space? Because that's a very, very quickly, I know we're pretty much
yeah. I mean, it's just again just driven by lots of conversations with RPs saying it's great you're willing to fund these homes, own them, take the occupational risk, but we also need more capital and equity in the development phase. So then there's a very kind of very simple conversation, and my colleagues Ben and Annette do a fantastic job around this, around sharing development risk as well, to enable funding to come in earlier so RPs can deliver more. Very happy to pick up any conversations about that if people want to get in touch offline.
Good stuff, thank you. It's an interesting question for Maggie about whether the regulator might do more in this space around ESG funding. Is there anything she sees from a regulatory perspective that may impact ESG funding in the future? Very quickly, Maggie.
I was just thinking that I think that the whole approach to consumer standards might actually have an impact. I think when it comes to registration, they're going to be much more interested in looking at it. They really are interested in the funding that goes alongside new registrations, new entrants. And so I think they'll be looking to see to what extent you can actually prove what you're saying. So I think there may be some more things coming in, but I'll answer Fiona separately outside of the, I'll come back to more detail outside of this.
That's great. Thank you very much. Well, I think that was a really good discussion. I've got to remember to ask for the poll results, or the poll question to be asked once again. We've still got 50 odd people here, so please do respond. Can ESG investment really help address the housing crisis? Has this discussion influenced things at all? Has it changed any minds? Has it changed the results? I mean, obviously it's not really comparable because we have more people responding at the start than now, so the results may be a little bit skewed, but let's just ask it anyway. So can ESG investment really help address the housing crisis? If we could get the results up on that one. No, pretty much the same. So what does that mean? It means maybe this session hasn't influenced you at all, which is absolutely fine. I'm not sure we were going to really answer that question with this webinar, but hopefully the discussion has been of interest and it's been informative. You know, we've covered lots, and I'm really appreciative to the panel for such a great discussion. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar as well to everyone that attended, and I'm sure we'll be back at some point to pick up this discussion once again. So it's just left for me to say thank you very much for attending, and thanks again to our panel for the great discussion.
Thank you.